Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Sarah Buino, and I'm delighted to have you join us today. The NARM Training Institute is offering a Level 2 NARM therapist training online so that you can attend from anywhere. The trauma field is evolving so quickly. Trauma-informed therapists who want to learn how to address the long-term impacts of adverse childhood experiences and complex post-traumatic stress disorder want to be trained in NARM. This online NARM therapist training is starting in April 2021 and July 2021, and they're filling up fast. So if you're interested, we'd encourage you to register now to reserve your spot. For more information and to register, please visit www.narmtraining.com/level2online. We look forward to you joining our growing international NARM community and are inspired to work with you to bring NARM to your clients and communities in order to transform trauma. And now on to today's guest. Adar Weinreb is an Israeli-American working in blockchain technology. He dedicates his free time to social activism, primarily building bridges between Israelis and Palestinians. Adar is the host of a YouTube show called The Great Debate. So please enjoy my wonderful conversation with Adar. Hello, Adar. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Hey, Sarah. It's great to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and you are where? Where in the world are you?
I'm currently in Tel Aviv, Israel, where I reside.
Yeah, as we were scheduling, I was like, oh, wait, yeah, you're not in the U.S. We've got to configure this a little differently than usual.
You were trying to book me for an evening time, your time zone, but that would be at like 3 a.m. over here in Israel.
Yes.
So, well, we made it work.
Right. I would never ask that of our guests to do an interview at 3 a.m. But so thank you so much for joining us. And Brad had connected us because I believe he follows you on social media. So I wanted to give you a chance to really introduce yourself and your work to our listeners, and then we'll dig into all the fun trauma stuff, if that's a thing.
Sure. So I'd say for the past 6 or so years, I've been involved in social activism here in Israel. And I do try to speak on multiple issues that I feel are important, but the primary focus of the work I've done has been connecting between Israelis and Palestinians. Being an Israeli, this conflict is close to home and close to heart. I'm half American as well. That's why my English sounds pretty damn good.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. But, as an Israeli, this conflict is important to me because it affects me. I've lost friends, either in war or in terror attacks. And as much as I feel it, it affects the Palestinians even more so. Israelis, in a sense, are lucky enough to not be reminded of the conflict every day. We can live our lives quite normally without being reminded. We're reminded whenever there's a terror attack or a war that breaks out, which is on a yearly basis. We are reminded. But Palestinians are reminded way more often every day when they need to stand at a checkpoint, when they see soldiers who are not of their own, guarding certain neighborhoods, if they need to be subject to home searches. All these things remind the Palestinians of the conflict every day. Now, it's hard to get Israelis to empathize with what Palestinians go through because they themselves are dealing with their own struggles. And this is one thing I've realized in my activism, that it's hard to get people mobilized for others when they themselves don't feel like they are in abundance themselves. That being said, I do recognize that our security here in Israel often has come at the expense of the well-being of another population. So for me, it's not enough to just live a comfortable life. I'm constantly reminding myself that our security comes at the expense of another group of people's well-being. So I view it as a moral obligation for myself, at least. I don't say it's a moral obligation for all people, but at least for myself, to do what I can to connect between both sides, because I firmly believe that as much as we're looking for a political solution, whether that's a one-state or two-state solution or something in between, no political solution will work if there's not some kind of reconciliation process and a process of humanizing the other side. So that is what my activism is. I'm not looking to push a specific political solution. I want to get to the point where most Palestinians can say they have Israeli friends and they love their Israeli friends, and most Israelis can say they have Palestinian friends and they love their Palestinian friends. Because once we achieve that, we'll be so much closer to achieving whatever solution will end up coming to be.
Well, let's back up a little bit and frame this for listeners. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but we had several episodes that really centered the trauma experience of Jewish people, one of them in, I think it was Norway, and then others in America. And I don't know, because all of us haven't been touched by it, that everyone who's listening right now really understands what is at the heart of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. So obviously there's a lot there, but could you kind of give us a nutshell of what that's about so that we can use that moving forward?
Sure, I'll try to do this briefly.
Yeah.
It started around 100 years ago. Well, you could say even over 100 years ago. A new Zionist movement began. And essentially what the new Zionist movement began was saying that the time has come for Jews to return to their ancestral homeland after 2,000 years. And this is something many people don't know. All Jews are indigenous, unless you've converted, but Jews generally are indigenous to this land, to the land of Israel. Mm-hmm. Around 2,000 years ago, we were exiled. We spent the past 2,000 years traveling all over the globe, sometimes being persecuted and chased from one place to another. And then in the countries we settled, we kind of picked up on some local customs, keeping some Middle Eastern customs. So you really had different Jewish communities all throughout the world who were a mix between their indigenous Jewish culture, but then the new culture that they picked up by living amongst people in Europe and in North Africa and in South America, wherever these communities of Jews went. After 2,000 years, and it's not that after 2,000 years, Jews decided they wanted to come back. For many Jews, it has been an aspiration to return to the land when the time permits it, right? It's not always easy to go and create a country, as we've discovered. But persecution in Europe was very bad against Jews. Then the Holocaust happened. It created a refugee crisis, which just got more and more Jews from Europe to come over to Israel and try to build a new home for themselves. This is a beautiful story if you are only hearing that side of it, and that's really the side I was raised on. The problem is that there were local populations living on this land when we returned. And at first it seemed like the local populations, at the time they did not identify as Palestinian, but they were local Arab communities scattered across the land. Their national identity as Palestinians also started developing around 100 years ago. When the concept of a nation state became popular, they were tired of being ruled by the Ottomans, which they were prior to the British, and they saw countries all over the world getting statehood. So these local Arab communities decided that, they want to start having a country, and then all of a sudden a bunch of Jews started showing up, also having aspirations for a nation. This started creating a conflict. The local populations were not open to the idea of a Jewish state existing on lands that they're currently inhabiting, and it's easy to understand why. But it seems like eventually that tension exploded and there began to be violence. Now, history is challenging. Different sides have different versions of history. Palestinians will cite the fact that some Palestinians were kicked out of their homes as the first act of violence. We will consider a massacre done in Hebron as the first act of violence towards us. So we have different narratives where we describe a different first act of violence, but regardless of who started it, and I actually don't think it's that important because the people who started it are no longer here. It's the offspring who now need to clean up the mess. But that began a very long cycle of violence that continues until today. So I don't even want to say it's a religious dispute. It might have something to do with religion. It's not a cultural dispute either. It is two people who both have national aspirations, whose national aspirations seem to get in the way of one another.
Mm-hmm. Well said.
And I would say that's as brief as I could go. I did leave out a whole lot of details, but it's a complex one, yeah.
Of course. And thank you for framing that for us. And thinking about how long it's been going on, I think listeners can really understand the tension and the conflict and how important it is to be able to see the other side. So I'd really love for you to talk more about that, because before we started, I was basically asking you, what do you know about trauma and how are we going to talk about this today? And you said, yeah, well, I've been working with trauma every single day, but not talking about it in that way. But so talking about this idea of being able to deal with one's own pain in order to see the other side. Do you want to speak on that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. And before I get into it, I would like to give a disclaimer, something that I think would help us get through this conversation, at least for the listeners. this is a conflict that arouses immense emotion, and understandably so. And I think that most people who are interested in this conflict have taken a definitive stance on who is the good guy and who's the bad guy. I'm not interested in playing that game. I'm interested in connecting between both sides. That doesn't mean that all things are equal between both sides. That doesn't mean that the injustice is equal. So I just want people to understand, I'm not making an equivalence between the pain collective groups go through. I'm not making a comparison between injustices. It's simply a recognition that at the end of the day, the people on both sides are harmed from this conflict. And as a humanist, I approach it as valuing all life of human worth. And I'm not looking to point fingers. I'm looking to solve problems. So I just want to put that out there. If you feel like I'm not attacking the side you think is evil, I'm sorry. I just don't view that as a productive approach forward. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, if I can just add in there too, that sounds a lot like how I feel in terms of anti-racism work and Black Lives Matter in the United States. And sometimes folks in that camp of Black Lives Matter want to say, like, you know, all police are bad and all these things are bad. And I feel exactly like you said, that narrative doesn't get us very far. Right. So I really love the way you're framing this in a very trauma-informed way, which is beautiful.
Makes me happy to hear that. And by the way, a lot of, you mentioned Black Lives Matter and anti-racism. So I do see a lot of parallels in the activism I do, my approach to activism, and my critiques of certain forms of activism I see across the board, both here in Israel, Palestine, and in the United States. So I think there's a lot we would agree on in that regard. When it comes to the trauma, so the majority of both Israelis and Palestinians have some amount of trauma. If you were a Palestinian, it's trauma from, first of all, any population living under the military rule of another population, that takes a psychological toll. This is something that's not discussed enough, but just the presence of forces that are not your own, who do not treat you as your own, that takes a psychological toll that I don't think has been explored enough, but that affects every single Palestinian. In addition to that, needing to wait at checkpoints, maybe you have a family member that was killed or put in jail by Israel. Maybe your home was searched at the middle of the night for no good reason or false information. All these are going to add to collective trauma. Jews, on the other hand, for us, we could root our trauma back to the Holocaust. For Ashkenazi Jews are the European ones, or the ones that have lived in Europe for the past few thousand years. And then there's Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews who are from North Africa and the Middle East, and their trauma is slightly different. In 1948, when the State of Israel was established, most of them were kicked out of their homes and then they migrated to Israel. So you have the expulsion of Jews from those nations that created trauma for them, and the Holocaust, which created immense trauma for Ashkenazi Jews. That trauma has been constantly reinforced for the past 100 or so years by terror attacks and war. So trauma very much is a part of the daily life of Israelis and Palestinians. I'm not an expert on trauma, but the impression I get from dealing with it day to day is it seems to have a tendency to radicalize us. It makes people more emotionally charged and less rational when it comes to trying to assess a certain situation. And it's very, very hard to be empathetic to who you view as your enemy, especially when that enemy has caused you trauma. So that's really how I see it manifested in a population that just wants to live in peace. And this is true about both populations. We just want to live in peace, but we have an enemy, and our ability to get to know the enemy is severely hindered by the trauma that most of us currently have.
Absolutely. I'm also thinking about, as you're talking about Jews essentially being cast out of so many different places that they called home and trying to find that place to land, one of the concepts we talk about in NARM is this connection survival style. And the hallmark of the connection survival style is, do I have a right to exist? Wanting to exist and not necessarily feeling that intrinsic right. And I'm feeling very deeply how that has been historically passed down through people who identify as Jewish.
Yeah, entirely. And it's important to understand the populations we're dealing with if we want to be effective. I think often that, and I mentioned rationality compared to emotion, but I don't think they're separate. I think often you have like intellectuals and scholars, they can understand conflict in very analytical and intellectual terms, but they don't understand that application of a given solution doesn't work if they're not taking into consideration the actual people they're dealing with. So that could be the people's culture, their shared history, their religion. So I think understanding the Jews' very difficult history and their mentality returning to this land, it just helps us understand the conflict better. So often when we hear people calling for Israel's destruction, and it's not uncommon, many Jews, when they hear a call for Israel's destruction, and this isn't just like the Ayatollah in Iran saying they want Israel destroyed. It's not uncommon for American activists to be anti-Zionist. And this is tricky because Zionism means two very different things to pro-Israel and anti-Israel people. If you're pro-Israel, it just means the right for Jewish self-determination. If you're anti-Zionist, it's described as akin to some kind of Jewish supremacy. Zionism in progressive circles in the United States, as well as in Palestinian circles, and you can understand why Palestinians would view it this way because Zionism directly harmed them, but they view it as inherently harmful and racist and supremacist. And Jews are just saying, no, it's just, we just want a country just like Germans can have a country, Americans can have a country. But if anybody deserves one, we should be top of the list because look at our history. Look how badly we were brutalized and look how the world did nothing. We're not going to listen to other countries and other people who tell us we don't deserve a nation. You weren't there when we were being killed. And I'm repeating a narrative that is ingrained very deep into the Israeli psyche. We were murdered. The world did nothing. We now have strength. We now can protect ourselves. The chance of Israel being dismantled somehow is close to none. And we're willing to fight and die in order to maintain our state. So I'm describing what is probably the average Israeli mentality. It's against all odds, we have survived. The world did not help us when we needed help. So we could trust nobody but ourselves. And if you don't understand this dynamic and you want to try to get involved in the conflict, like how can you? How can you be productive and helpful if you don't understand this challenging dynamic? So this is part of the work I do, trying to teach Palestinians this dynamic. How do you get Palestinians to listen? Well, it's simple. You listen to them.
Right?
This is another thing I tell people all the time. If you ask somebody about their life and their struggle and their people, they will tell you. I'm saying this to anyone listening, if you're an Israeli or Palestinian or whatever conflict you might be involved with, it could be Republicans and Democrats.
Right.
If you ask somebody about themselves, they will share. And once they see that you care about them, they will be much more open to hearing who you are and what your side is. So most Israelis don't know Palestinians. 20% of Israel's population are Israeli Arabs. Some of them identify as Palestinian. But when I refer to Palestinians, I'm talking about non-Israeli citizens currently living in the West Bank. Israeli Arabs, most Israelis do not view Israeli Arabs as the enemy. They accept them as our fellow citizens. When it comes to Palestinians, we view them as the enemy, but most of us have never met a Palestinian. The only thing we hear about them is on the news and from our politicians, both of which have incentive to give an over-sensationalized version of the truth, focusing on the worst members of a group, because it's advantageous for media and for politicians to act in that way. The same goes on in Palestinian society. They hear about Israelis, the worst of us. What they're taught about us is only reinforced by experience they have meeting soldiers in the West Bank. So if you are dependent on your information about another population from politicians and media, that's a very problematic...
That sounds familiar, right, American friends?
Exactly. I tell these people, turn off the news and just start meeting new people, speaking to them. So we don't know one another, and we have a lifetime of teachings and fear to stop us from wanting to get to know one another. But I have noticed from experience, and in the work I do connect between a fair amount of Israelis and Palestinians. After just a few minutes of dialogue, you could see how a lifetime of teachings and beliefs begin to change. They don't change overnight. Beliefs normally take longer to change. They're deep-rooted, but that plants a seed in the individual's mind, which over time, I hope will grow into a beautiful garden, one that is, about peace and reconciliation and unity.
There's a lot of things I want to comment on, but what I think might be really interesting to listeners to hear about is, how did you get there? What about your story helped you recognize, wait, we're not doing this right. Like, we need to actually share stories with one another rather than just be adversaries.
That's a good question, and I do have an interesting story to tell in that regard. I served in the Israeli army. I did 3 years in the Israeli army. My views, it's fair to say, were quite different at that point. And on the topic of the military, it's complex because Israel needs a military for us to exist. So I'm not against the military, but there's a lot that the military does that I view as wrong or unjust. So it's complicated. It's not this. You could actually look at this as similar to police.
Right.
We can acknowledge that there's systemic issues with police, but that's not the same as saying there should be no police. So I'm in the category of saying there are systemic issues with the military, but I support the military's right to exist because I would not be able to live here if there was no military. So that's important to understand. In my military service, I was guarding, and we're not like these Rambo soldiers. We're just kids, the average age of an Israeli soldier is 18, 19, 20 years old. And, we're board guarding, and I was just looking at a poster on the wall trying to pass time, and the poster showed Hamas training techniques. Hamas is our enemy. They're a designated terror organization. We're at war with them. Now, one of the Hamas soldiers was crawling through sand. I looked at him, and I was crawling through sand that same day. And I began to compare myself to Hamas, to my sworn enemy. And I asked myself, I said, if I was born in Gaza, would that be me crawling in sand? Or could that be a loved one? Does his family view him as a hero and me as a terrorist? Is that possible? Now, again, this didn't change my views overnight, but that was the start to something different. And it was a start for me to understand that we are just products of our environment. And had I been born in Gaza, I very well may be a Hamas soldier, the enemy of who I am. So that creates a full, paradigm shift once it really clicks. And if we could acknowledge the difference between us is simply dependent on what side of the border we were born on, how can you hate somebody for just being born in a certain place? So that got me to understand the importance of humanization. And this did take years. I didn't become an activist in my days in the army. It probably started around 3 years after I got out of the army. There was a war with Gaza, with Hamas, and I saw all my Israeli friends post on Facebook, Israel under attack, because hundreds of rockets were being shot into Israel every day. I have some Muslim and Palestinian friends. Well, now I have many. At the time I had some, and I saw them posting Gaza under attack. I didn't see a single person post Gaza and Israel under attack, or the people of Israel and Palestine are suffering now because there's war. I didn't see a single post of someone coming with this humanistic message, understanding that both sides are victimized to this conflict. And even if you think one entity is more right and more wrong, that says nothing about the individuals living in these countries who suffer all the same. Suffering is suffering at the end of the day. Pain is pain. So seeing that divide and seeing how rare a message of unity was, I started posting messages of unity, messages of humanization. And I saw that people were responding very well to them, and that just motivated me to...
Oh, really?
Not everybody. Whenever you humanize somebody's enemy, you in turn become the enemy.
That's what I'm seeing on Facebook anyway, yeah.
Yeah, so from personal experience, maybe if you were to say, and I got some flack for this as well, but if you were to say we need to connect with Trump supporters, you may get some heat for that, because you're viewing a Trump supporter as a human that is worth engaging with. And if somebody is convinced that in order to support Trump, you need to be an absolutely horrible human being, and that all Trump supporters are horrible human beings, you are now humanizing a horrible human being. You in turn can become the target of attack. So,
well, let's pick that apart a little bit, because I think that's what's so, I can tell why Brad, listens to your work, because you're holding the nuances quite well. And when we are asking to humanize either side of whatever debate that we're having, we're not saying that what someone is doing is okay, right? That's literally what you said at the beginning, that we're not saying that one side is better than the other, or we're even taking sides at all. It's just recognizing there are hurt people causing pain to one another because they're not able to see each other's side. And it's funny, when Trump was elected, before I went through NARM training, would kind of skip over anger and go straight to hurt. And my thought was, yeah, we need to have empathy. We need to try to understand the other people. And I got so much pushback for that. And what I've recognized since then is when I skipped over the anger and didn't move through that and didn't really feel my own pain, the anger of how Trump treats women and how he's racist and all sorts of things, I wasn't getting in touch with my trauma. And so then I was bypassing and asking other people then to bypass, right? And so what I really hear you doing is say, no, we're not bypassing anything. We're all looking at all of the pieces of all of the ways that we've all been in pain and suffered from trauma.
Correct. I think that expression of emotion is very important. It's natural. It's healthy. It also helps us work through conflict. What I do just try to, if I were to guide the emotion in any direction, I would say rather take your anger out on institutions and governments and bodies rather than individuals, because generally speaking, anger towards individuals, and again, sometimes it's entirely justified, but in a situation where it's Israel, Palestine, or Republicans, Democrats, anger at what would be half the population, it does nothing to convince them to change. If anything, it just pushes them further apart instead of bringing them closer to you. It fuels this cycle of anger. And in addition to that, I will say that, and the concept of bypassing is fascinating, and it's something I'd love to discuss more and learn more about, because there's definitely a trade-off, right? When do we let go of our anger? Because as long as we hold anger within us, it's within us. So we could be angry at somebody, but we feel it more than they'll feel our anger. So I view anger and many of these emotions as a poison of sorts that we hold within us. That being said, it's natural. It helps mobilize us. So it's just about finding the balance, knowing how to feel your anger, feel your emotions, allow them to mobilize you, but then find a way to heal so you're not harming yourself along the way. And I'd like to make this point when it comes to activism. So I consider myself an activist from a place of privilege. I speak out on issues, but the issues don't always affect me directly. Now, if I speak about anti-Semitism in Israel, Palestine, it does relate to me to an extent, but fighting for better lives for the Palestinians, I very well could just not care and just live my life. Or if I speak out against racism, I'm not a victim of racism day to day. I could very well ignore it. So I do recognize that my activism on an emotional level feels very different from people who themselves are oppressed or victimized by a conflict. So I think it's important to acknowledge that difference. And, me as coming from a place of privilege, I try to be very understanding and compassionate of other people and learning from them. That being said, I think that part of activism, regardless of if it comes from a place of privilege, and again, easier said than done, me coming from a place of privilege, it's easier to do, but there will always, or at least for this foreseeable future, but probably always, there will always be some amount of injustice in this world. There will always be something happening to make us furious. There's always something to be furious about. So I hear activists saying, my anger is justified and this anger is helping us solve this problem. But once that problem's solved, there's another problem. So if your approach is that anger is necessary in order to bring about positive change, then you're destining yourself to a life of anger and pain. And I hate to see that, because at any given moment, there's something to be angry about, but there's also something to be happy about. There's something to be excited and inspired about.
Be grateful for.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of darkness in the world, but there's so much beauty. And I want activists to remember that do not let your activism be at the expense of your well-being. There's a way to fight the good fight. There's a way to inspire change. It doesn't need to come at the expense of your emotional well-being. Right.
Well, and I can speak to how we think about anger in NARM, and it's such a big concept that it's hard to, kind of like you said in the beginning, to really boil something down to very brief. But essentially the belief in NARM is that because of our experience of trauma in early childhood, our emotions that were thwarted are protest, which then turns into anger, and grief over what we didn't get that we deserved as children. And so often we shut one or both of those down at the expense of staying connected to what we know is true and authentic within ourselves, right? And so when you talk about activists really leaning into their anger, what I think we might say from a NARM perspective is that might be coming from a place of child consciousness, which is the trauma speaking, essentially, right? Coming from a trauma place. And so if something bad happens to me and I'm angry about it as a reaction, that's just perpetuating the trauma, rather than if I allow myself to experience the anger or the sadness or whatever it is that needs to come from that, after I've really given space for that anger to be there, then on the other side of that, I usually have like better reasoning skills, better ability to make choices of how I want to use that information rather than just having it be this knee-jerk reaction that just comes from the trauma.
Right. So you're saying the approach is to feel the anger and just sit with it.
It's a bit more complex than that, but sure, we can boil it down to that. That's probably the easiest way to put it. Yeah, within NARM, we're sitting with it with the therapist who's essentially helping us reconnect with what we know is true, right? Because when bad things happen, we have a right to be angry. When we get hurt, we have a right to grieve. And it's just that we've systematically shut that down for so long that we have a hard time accessing it in a real way. I can just share my own experience in my therapy and working with my own childhood trauma. Anger that comes from trauma feels very fiery. It feels like heat. It feels like it's almost like I'm pushed from behind. But when I'm experiencing like the real anger that comes from the hurt that I experienced as a child, it's actually very quiet. And it feels very expansive, but not in a way that's going to endanger other people, just in a way that liberates me.
Interesting. This is fascinating. I'd love to learn more about this.
Yeah.
Recently in my activism, I've really been focusing more on understanding human psychology. Mm-hmm. Because again, if we want to be able to change the world, it comes down to humans changing themselves.
Right.
Or humans being born into an environment which achieves better results. There's like two ways to look at it. It's like personal responsibility, but then also systemic change. And this can be like understood in the divide between the American right and the American left. The right is very big on personal responsibility, every individual for themselves. Mm-hmm. And the left is more so about systems and government and changing these systems in order to achieve better societal results. Mm-hmm. I think both those narratives are touching on a very important truth. One, that you are a product of your environment. So to say, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, in order to be rich, you just need to work hard. Let's be real. It's, your ability to work hard, your ability to know what to focus on, your ability to find motivation. These are all things that are dependent on so many environmental factors. And it's not as simple as telling somebody to just take personal responsibility. So obviously, systemic change is essential to changing human outcome. That being said, part of the environment that forms us is the values we are taught. And if one of the values we are taught is to always take responsibility for a situation, if the values we're taught help us empower us as individuals, then we'll obviously be better off. So it's like, on one hand, we need to instill values into society that empower us as individuals, but we also need to build a society that's just and equitable. So I view it as trying to find the balance between these two truths.
And I mean, that's really the conflict that's happening in America right now with the coronavirus. Is our culture has been so individualistic. And if we talk about it from a trauma perspective, right, like, so the colonizers coming over were coming from trauma, feeling oppressed, feeling in their trauma, settling in the United States and being like, well, I'm not going to do it that way. And then the reaction is to go way too far into the extreme of individualism. And we see that playing out today by people not being willing to wear a mask in order to save our country because we're dying. And it's beyond when I really think about what is happening right now. So that's another, I think, example of when we're really reacting from our trauma instead of reacting from a real place of being connected to self. And when we're connected to self, when we're connected to our hearts, of course we're going to care about other people. But that's not the message. That's not the value that we're instilling in our culture.
Right. It's a very individualistic, every individual for themselves. It's challenging. Is the process in which one needs to undergo to solve their complex trauma, is that improving as the years pass? Are the tools we have improving?
I would say so. And Brad can probably give you a more detailed answer on this. But from my vantage point, really, it's only been like the past 10 years that we've started to really understand what trauma is and how it affects people. And I think that, information seems to be rapidly increasing in all areas. Yeah. And so I think the trauma field is one of those too. And I have a client who came from a trauma background, has a child, and thinks about, what her child is going to experience. And so we think about the lineage of her mom coming from a place where she was violently abused. And she didn't abuse her child. And then her child is now a parent and is coming to therapy to try to resolve her trauma in order to not do the same to her child. And as I see that happening with more and more families, that gives me hope that society is being transformed because people are seeking healing. People are asking for it. Like, my practice right now, we have so many referrals. We're constantly turning them away because we can't accommodate everybody who's asking for help right now. And I think that asking for help is an acknowledgement of the pain that we're really experiencing, which is trauma.
Can you always differentiate? Like, is it easy to differentiate if somebody has complex trauma rather than them just struggling with depression? Or do most people have some form of trauma or another?
Yeah, the belief, I think, from most trauma professionals is that everything stems from some sort of trauma. And the way that I teach it to my students and my clients is that trauma is essentially on a spectrum, like everything is on a spectrum, right? And some folks have the extreme trauma where they've experienced violence and war and these things that everyone considers trauma. And then, on the other side of the spectrum, it can be being invalidated by your parent. It can be you saying, I want to be a firefighter when you grow up, and the parent saying, no, you're going to be a doctor. And obviously just that one time itself is not trauma, but invalidation on a regular basis is, because it's the parent not seeing the child clearly and not allowing the child to connect with what they know is true within them. Again, abandoning oneself over and over, that is trauma. And so depression can come, right, if you are a person who continues to abandon yourself over and over, or more likely, I kind of think of depression as anger turned inward and not being able to be angry at the systems, whether it be your parents or whether it be government or whoever it is. If I'm not allowing myself to be angry at those systems, then I just, like you said, keep it inside, and it's this poison. And that can flip to hopelessness, right? And then if I can't express this anger and I can't do anything about it, I just turn it inward, and then it's hopeless. And then I just shut down.
Yeah. How do we do that to the 10 million people living from the river to the sea here on the land? Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, that's really what NARM hopes to. We really want more people to have access to this type of work. And so Brad and Larry and the entire team are really training a lot of folks right now in the hopes that we're going to be able to make a really big impact in the world.
Amazing. So what you're doing, I definitely commend you all. And it seems like it's certainly one of the ways forward. I wonder how you view this from like a NARM perspective, but would you view as something like just engaging with the other side? So let's say you have fear over another group of people. And now you sit with someone from that group and you get to know them as an individual. Would you view that as part of the trauma healing process?
We haven't talked about that in NARM, but just me as a person, I can say yes.
It seems to make sense.
Right. And in other activists that I follow, there's an activist named Robin Henderson Espinoza, and they were trained as a clergy, I guess, is what you say. And they recognize that, a lot of religious people are not necessarily practicing the way that Jesus would want them to practice. And so they really talk about like literally sitting down and having a meal with another person as, a way to connect and begin to heal the collective trauma that we're all in the midst of, just as you said, to really, truly like listen and help me understand from your perspective what's going on, and then being willing to listen to the other side's perspective. Right.
To build on that, I mentioned earlier that I think understanding psychology helps give us the keys to whatever solution we're looking for. But this is something I would recommend to all people when they want to engage. And this is a lifelong process. It's being effective communicators. So a willingness to want to engage is the first step. Being able to effectively engage is the second. We have a huge challenge with that here in Israel, Palestine, because we don't speak the same language. So imagine a reconciliation process with people who don't speak the same language. Very challenging. So a lot of the work is done in English because that is a language that the majority of both sides speak fairly well. Most Israelis speak English. I don't know what the exact number is amongst Palestinians, but I think the majority of both sides. But again, it's a challenge not being able to reconcile in the language we are most comfortable with. That being said, our ability to be effective communicators will just increase our ability to impact change, help people work through their trauma, and unify between populations. So if we can understand their psychology, but not only their psychology, their culture, and deeply understand their narrative and aspirations, I think if we look at it in those terms, it gives us the basis we need in order to have the right conversations. In addition to that, I'll add that just because something's true doesn't mean it's productive.
Ooh, there's a quote. Yes.
I think that, we hear often people praised for being truth speakers. I think this is one of the things that people really liked about Trump, which was interesting because he's a pathological liar, but they thought,
I know.
Yeah. Literally a pathological liar, but he often got credit for telling it like it is. Or, someone like Ben Shapiro, for example, or there's many other commentators that, they're praised by people for telling the truth like it is. But if a truth you're telling isn't heard by the person you're telling it to, then it's pointless. An analogy that I like to think of, if you see somebody walking down the street and you decide to run up to them and you start yelling at them really loudly, the sky is blue, the sky is blue, you are telling the truth. The sky is in fact blue, but that doesn't mean like you're making the world a better place and telling that truth. So the reason I bring this up when it comes to communication, it's do not present what you want to present in a way that you and your people find approachable. Say it in a way that the person you're speaking to can hear you. Mm-hmm. And again, this takes a lot of practice, but when I speak to Palestinians, I'm not having the same exact conversation that I do when I have to Israelis. Now, this could also come off as not being completely consistent, right? Someone would say, oh, you're two-faced, you're having separate conversations, but that's not what it is. That's what it means to be an effective communicator, to know your audience, to understand their narrative, and to speak to them in a way that will be effective. So truth on its own is not a virtue. Truth that progresses a positive goal, well, that is a virtue.
And again, you're so very clearly speaking to the nuance of everything. And I love when I hear people who aren't therapists being able to speak this way, because that gives me hope that we really are able to have more productive conversations about our differences and our struggles. And there's so much more we could talk about. Will you tell folks where they can find you and learn more about your work?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me on all my social media channels. In addition to that, I do have a YouTube channel that currently is under the name The Great Debate, but the name may, in fact, we're thinking of changing the name sometime in the next few weeks, so the name may change, but a link to that will be in the description. In addition to that, I'd like to invite everyone listening to a Discord community we have. For those unfamiliar, Discord is a new app similar to WhatsApp, but with different groups in it. And we have a community. You enter the portal, let's say, you're in the Great Debate community, and there you will see different tabs for different categories. So we have a tab for geopolitics, U.S. politics, a tab for Israel-Palestine, and there's also a feature there where you click a tab and then you're connected with your voice and video if you decide. So on a daily basis, there are Israelis and Palestinians that are getting on these conversations and just talking with one another. People who have never met.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is beautiful. It sometimes will start as a text conversation. There's a disagreement. They recognize all too well that it's hard to reach conclusions via typing. So they say, let's hop in the lounge. That's the name of our voice channel. And then they'll have a voice conversation, and those voice conversations last for hours. So this is something happening on a daily basis. It is extremely inspiring. Yes, Sarah, yes. I'll send you a link as well.
Please.
I'd love for you to check it out. And anyone here, we'd love to have you. It's not just for Israelis and Palestinians. It's for any individual who, either cares about that conflict or just cares about having these nuanced and compassionate conversations about important issues.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for all the really important work you're doing. I'm really impressed with the way that you hold nuance, and you're just changing the world. That's so awesome.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate you all giving me this opportunity, and it's good to have allies on the other side of the world where we can work together on such important missions. And yeah, I hope once the world goes back to relative normal, we could meet in person at some point too.
Yes, yes. I would love to go to Tel Aviv, so we'll make that happen.
Let's do it. Let's make it happen.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. You can connect with us in many ways. On Instagram, find us under @the NARM Training Institute, on Twitter @NARM Training, and Facebook @NARM Training as well. The NARM Training Institute also offers the Inner Circle, an online self-paced learning program intended for anyone who is interested in joining an international online community focused on healing complex trauma. You can find more information about these trauma-informed learning programs in addition to other resources on the website, www.narmtraining.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.